Hello and welcome to this special interview with London's 2021 mayoral candidates. My name is Jason Okendire and I'll be hosting this interview with the Liberal Democrat candidate Luisa Porritt. This event has been organised by the Home of Black British History, the Black Cultural Archives, whose mission is to collect, preserve and celebrate the histories of people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK. The questions asked today have been sent in by BCA's social media audience. So let's begin. So good morning, Luisa.
Good morning, Jason.
How are you doing today?
Very well, thanks. How are you? Thank you for having me here.
Yes, I'm doing very well. And thank you for having us, and also to BCA for hosting this talk between us. So I want to get straight in, thinking about the race report and the response and backlash to it. Would you say that institutional racism exists, and if so, what do you plan to do? What do you plan to do to tackle it as London Mayor?
Well, of course, institutional racism exists in our country. You only have to hear the lived experience of Black and other ethnic minority communities in Britain to know that that is the case. And it's far too often that when Black and other ethnic minority Londoners interact with our institutions, they are treated in an unequal way, and we know that discrimination exists. So I thought that report from the government into whether institutional racism exists in Britain was frankly really insulting to so many communities in our country by denying their lived experience. And so as mayor, I would seek to make London an actively anti-racist city. We need to tackle the root causes of racial inequality, and I'll do everything in my power to ensure that. For one thing, making sure that there are proper equality impact assessments that go into any decision making that I take and City Hall takes, and that is done thoroughly, actually, because I think too often they're glossed over. And I will work with businesses and community organisations and councils to actively tackle discrimination in our city.
So you've spoken about, the interaction of Black people with different institutions and the levels of, violence and discrimination that can occur there. Can you name which institutions in Britain and in London in particular that you think that, Black people have an adverse or negative experience with?
Yeah, absolutely. One of them is within the mayor's direct line of responsibility, and that's the Metropolitan Police. We know that disproportionately it's Black Londoners who are stopped under stop and search powers, particularly suspicionless stop and search, which is why, as mayor, I would scrap the use of suspicionless stop and search by the Metropolitan Police, because that only fosters mistrust between the police and Black Londoners and makes Black Londoners feel targeted, and that is wrong. Innocent people shouldn't be being stopped under blanket powers when an incident of knife crime has taken place, for example. We saw this only earlier in the week when there was the tragic death of a 14-year-old boy, and then the whole of the borough of Newham was put under a Section 60 order. That is not fair. That's nearly 20% of the population in that borough that could have got stopped.
Yeah. And what will you be doing to address the issues and concerns raised by countless stakeholders about the process, methodology and approaches deployed in writing and publishing the widely discredited Government Commission on Racial Equality and Disparities report?
Well, I share a lot of the concerns you're referring to. I spoke out against the conclusions of the report at the time it was published, and highlighted that it denies the lived experience of Black, Asian and other ethnic minority communities in Britain, and the extent to which racism still exists in our society, and the sheer amount of work that we need to do to tackle it collectively, not putting the burden on Black and other ethnic minority communities, and not denying their experiences. We have to work together to root out systemic racism from our country, and I will always be a strong voice as mayor. There's you have a powerful platform as the Mayor of London, lobbying the government to acknowledge that lived experience and to tackle it at every level, one of which has to start with our education system.
Yeah. So thinking about the arts and culture space for a moment. So this is a little bit of a long question, so if you just bear with me. On the 13th of December 2007, the British government confirmed in a press statement that the 23rd of August, UNESCO's Day for the International Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition, will be adopted as the focal date for national commemorations in the years to come. The Mayor of London at the time inaugurated and hosted a commemorative event for the occasion, but this was not continued by the new mayor from 2008. The new mayor of London in 2016 reinstituted the August 23rd commemorative event in 2018. If elected as mayor in May 2021, will you commit to continuing the event throughout the entirety of your term and providing appropriate funding that is in line with commemorating such a significant piece of London and British history?
Yes, absolutely. I sign up to that commitment. It's so important that we incorporate an understanding of the acts of the slave trade into more of our national history. So I would keep that event going and make sure that it gets the appropriate funding that it needs.
And how will you support the educational opportunities for Black Londoners, including what you will do to make sure that our histories are taught in our schools?
Well, education isn't a direct power of the mayor, but I mentioned before, the mayor has a big influencing role to play, and I would be using that platform to lobby the government to improve inclusion of Black history in our school curriculums, celebrating Black culture, but also recognising the historical inequalities that still permeate and affect our society today, and what the legacy of slavery has done that means that racism does still exist in our country. And I would do what I could with the mayor's limited powers over adult education as well. I'd also seek to ensure that we have a national statue constructed in London to commemorate the Windrush generation and their contribution to our city. So I would work with the Windrush groups over the location and content of that, of course, but I think it's important to also commemorate and celebrate the contribution of this community. I made my first visit, actually, once I was selected as mayoral candidate to Brixton. And that was something that came up when I was talking to people there. So that's the sort of thing that I would be doing. And I'll be using my voice to influence nationally as well and cross-party to make sure that the government is diversifying our curriculum and making sure that the whole of the UK population is educated about Black history and Black experiences.
And in your years as a Liberal Democrat politician, have you kept up like an engagement with Black communities, with Windrush commemoration groups? Like, what is your track record?
Sure. Well, I've not been in politics for that long. You may or may not know this. I only joined the Liberal Democrats in 2016. I'm a councillor in Camden. So Camden as a borough, although not so much my ward, is very diverse, and we are very proud to engage with and celebrate all of Camden's communities. And I've been a strong advocate, actually, as a councillor in Camden. When the Black Lives Matter protests happened last year, for example, we did a cross-party motion, and I spoke out strongly about racism and scrapping suspicionless stop and search, and the need to improve diversity within my own party. I was a member of the European Parliament for London as well. I spent a lot of my time in Brussels, so I didn't get to do a lot of engagement with many groups in general, but I know to be mayor of our great city that you have to work with all of London's communities. And so that's what I would be doing.
Yeah. So thinking about support for artists and cultural workers. So, British minority artists, as unique as they are, as much as they give, often don't feel as supported by the cities and its, artistic institutions. So what plans do you have to make sure that Black British artists and cultural workers can really shine?
Well, our party is committed to improving diversity and inclusion in the arts. So one of the things that we would do, a manifesto commitment of ours for this election, is to support local artists in underrepresented communities with targeted grant funding. So that's one of the things that I would do. I would also help to improve access to the arts for young people from low-income backgrounds by funding free ticket giveaways to West End shows, for example.
What tangible commitment can cultural events such as Sankofa Day in Trafalgar Square, the Hyde Park Memorial to victims of the slave trade, Africa in London, Notting Hill Carnival, and Windrush Day get from you to support these, grassroots people's projects beyond verbal acknowledgement? And I'm thinking particularly of, zoning into Notting Hill Carnival. I mean, every year that it's been on, there's always been, press attacks or, some politicians suggesting that it should be banned, even though its crime rate is lower than some major festivals. What will you be doing to make sure that these, cultural events are protected, particularly since, current legislation is looking at, banning mass events in the form of mass protests, and there's some concern about where mass events like Notting Hill Carnival could end up being dragged into that kind of remit, and how, the kind of seizure of power of lockdown could end up curtailing Black cultural events and spaces.
Well, I'm a big fan of Notting Hill Carnival. I've been a few times myself in recent years. Obviously, it was sad that we couldn't have it last year. And so I think it's really important that as long as it's safe to do so, that it can go ahead again this year. And I will always make sure that that event is protected. It's such an important of London's fabric to have that annual event. And as for the other events that you mentioned, I will work with local councils, the police and City Hall to ensure that they all get the funding they need and the logistical support in order to go ahead and actively work with organisers so that they are supported in bringing these events about.
Yeah, and of course,
sorry. I just wanted to add that I would also take an intersectional approach. So I'll make sure that events like Black Pride are delivered as well.
Sure. And what's your understanding of intersectional? I think that's it's interesting that you brought that up. Relation to Black Pride. I mean, me myself, I'm a Black gay man, so it's important that our cultural events are overlapping and cater towards different elements of the community. But what's your understanding of intersectionality, and do you make a commitment to particularly Black LGBT Londoners, and what does that look like in terms of tangible commitments?
Yeah. So, well, my understanding of intersectionality is that, well, I think in a place like London, this is something we're really starting to recognise and embrace more, that people often have multiple identities, and those should all be celebrated and owned with pride. But sadly, we also know that the lived experience of anyone who is intersectional in any way is going to be harder. Because if you're already a minority and then you fit into other minority or groups that are discriminated against, your lived experience will be more difficult. So I think that's something that we need to recognise and really work to tackle as a society. And certainly I'll be doing that as mayor as much as I can. In terms of support for the LGBTQ plus community, I would create dedicated spaces for them. I'd provide support for charities helping those communities. I would give a protected status to LGBTQ plus bars and other venues in our city, because we know that we've lost too many of them in recent years. And I think it's really important that it's, especially where there are organisations and venues and events that are recognising intersectionality, that those are protected and celebrated.
Thank you. You speak a lot about lived experience, and I think that's interesting as well. But, what do you think are the greatest structural issues that are affecting Black Londoners today? I mean, you've spoken about the Metropolitan Police already, but are there any other areas of life and institutions and structures in London which make life particularly perilous for Black people?
Sadly, most of them. I mean, I mentioned I'm a councillor here in Camden, and I know that over 75, sorry, I think it's over 75, maybe over 70% of families in overcrowded accommodation in the borough are from Black and Asian and other ethnic minority communities. It's not right that our Black and other ethnic minority residents are suffering from the worst housing conditions. And that's not an isolated incident in one borough. This is too much the case everywhere, not just in London, but across the country. We know that there are huge health inequalities as well for Black Londoners. We've seen that over the last year with COVID-19, that has disproportionately impacted Black and other ethnic minority Londoners. And also that the government has refused to, while it took them a long time to acknowledge that, they also haven't really done anything in response to it. And I think that's extremely disappointing. So there's a huge amount of areas that we need to tackle. We talked about education earlier. I think that is vital as well.
And thinking about COVID-19, I mean, there's been a lot of grief for Black communities this year, and all communities across London as well, and across the United Kingdom. And what kind of space would you be making as mayor for recognising that grief and memorialising, the victims of the COVID-19 pandemic? Because at the moment, on a national scale, it doesn't feel like we have that national commemoration. So, what can you commit to Londoners, and particularly to Black Londoners who have felt the sharpest end of the pandemic?
Yeah, I have committed to a memorial for the victims of COVID-19 in London. And I think it's right that that specifically recognises the disproportionate impact that there has been on Black Londoners.
Right. And if elected as mayor, what will you do to tackle the increasing cases of Londoners living in terrible quality of housing due to neglect from housing associations, landlords, and councils?
I mean, this is such a deep injustice, and there's a huge amount of things that we need to do. One of the things that I would do is set up the London Housing Company. This would be a City Hall backed developer, not for profit, to take charge of delivering the affordable homes that Londoners need, because we've been discussing it already disproportionately. The lack of supply of good quality housing is impacting Black Londoners in our city, and that is wrong. So there's no substitute for increasing the supply of affordable housing, which is why I would set that up to be a new player in London's housing market and finally fix our housing crisis by doing things like exploring the potential to convert empty office space coming onto the market as a result of home working into quality, affordable housing, bringing empty homes back into use across the capital, and building on sites where we have public land owned by TfL and the NHS, for example. That's how we're going to fix that problem of poor and overcrowded housing, by setting a new standard and making sure there are genuinely affordable social homes for rent available. Sadiq Khan hasn't even built half of the affordable homes that he promised back in 2016. So I think this is an area where Londoners have been let down by successive mayors and successive governments, frankly. So I would make it a top priority to tackle this. We also need to address issues in the private rental market, and I'll introduce a London-wide licensing scheme to regulate London's landlords.
Yeah, and often when we talk about gentrification and housing, sometimes we just talk about the people who move into these places or who set up, expensive cereal bars or whatever. And sometimes that invisibilizes the developers driving behind this, and also the local authorities who can also be complicit in this as well. And sometimes, give the green light and don't stand up for their residents enough. Will you stand up to developers, and will you stand up also to local authorities who are, prioritizing private developers over the constituents who they are meant to serve and represent? What's your plan for really tackling this issue?
Yeah, absolutely, I will do. I've seen this too often, again, as a councillor, developers getting their way, reneging on their affordable housing commitments and claiming that what they promised suddenly isn't viable after gaining planning permission. It's completely wrong. And too often, frankly, officers from councils across our boroughs roll over and are too close to developers. Whereas what we need are developments that are actually meeting the needs of local communities across our city, including delivering affordable housing. But that's where the London Housing Company has the real potential to disrupt the market by creating a new standard for housing. For example, I won't give any city hall contracts to developers who haven't addressed fire safety issues in their existing stock. There are thousands of leaseholders in London who are affected by the cladding and wider building safety crisis. And I would make sure that private developers that haven't dealt with that aren't rewarded. I have supported the campaign against the Taylor Tower, and I'll continue to be a strong voice, not allowing private developers to take advantage. I was in Brent on the weekend and in an area called Alperton, and I had been there a year earlier. And suddenly there's so much overdevelopment there. And while, of course, we all welcome housing, unfortunately, most of it is luxury flats in tall towers, not the homes that Londoners need. So that's why I think we need this new city hall developer that's not for profit to actually take charge of this process. So we don't have to rely on dodgy deals with developers anymore, because it's completely unacceptable.
And what are you planning to do to make London more affordable for young Black adults, from housing to transport to council tax? What are your plans?
Well, on housing, I think we've covered that quite extensively. So increasing the supply of housing is going to bring down the cost of housing overall, which is why I think it's vital that we are actually creating more affordable housing. And I'll use every means possible to deliver that. In terms of transport, I have been a strong advocate for protecting free travel for under 18-year-olds. We know that there are many young Londoners who depend on that in order to get to school, let alone to enjoy the amazing things that our city has to offer. And that disproportionately it's Black and other ethnic minority Londoners who rely on that. So I'm pleased that that's off the table in the TfL negotiations for now, but should it ever come up again, I will continue to oppose it. The Liberal Democrats have been doing that at every level throughout.
Would you commit to...
Yeah, carry on.
Would you commit to a freeze in TfL prices for 2022?
So I would certainly commit to protecting free travel for under 18s and also for over 60s. One of the things that I want to do is introduce a flexible travel card, which would be a 4-day-a-week pass rather than the 7-day card that you can get currently. And that would actually be 4 days of travel for the price of 3. So it would save Londoners over £500 a year and better reflect the way that our working practices are changing. Well, for many Londoners anyway, they'll be spending more time working from home, shifting to more of a hybrid model, spending part of the time in the office, but not necessarily having a 5-day commute. So that then frees up a day to enjoy our city more. The fares freeze that Sadiq Khan introduced actually didn't help Londoners very much, because it was only for zones 1 and 2, and that really just benefited tourists. And it also has contributed to the problems that TfL are now facing. It's in deep financial difficulty, but I also have a plan to address that and put TfL's finances on a more sustainable footing so we can invest in more public transport projects, which is what we desperately need. So I do think the government should be stepping in to support our network in the short term. We've been through this unprecedented crisis, and TfL's financial model relies on income from fares, which won't be sustainable in the future with more people working from home. So I'd introduce a fairer pay-as-you-go road pricing scheme in order to help put TfL's finances on a more sustainable footing for the future.
So thinking about the 2013 very sad death of the young black girl Ella Adu Kissy Deborah, which was ruled to be air pollution in London was ruled to be, the cause of her death, because she had asthma. What are your plans for making sure that London's air is clean and breathable, and that people have the right access to green spaces? Because something that's also interesting is that more and more Black Londoners are starting to leave their apartments in the capital in search of green space, in search of cleaner air, to have gardens. Do you see that change as positive or negative for the city? And what are you going to do to make sure that London is habitable and breathable?
Yeah, well, I can understand why a lot of people have been leaving London, especially if they don't have to work in the centre of London anymore. Then I think for a lot of people, they think, well, London's so expensive. Why am I spending all this money to live in a tiny space, probably without much access to green space, when I can get more for my money outside of the capital? I have a lot of friends that have made or been making those decisions in the last year as a result of the way the pandemic has accelerated big changes in our city. But I think that we have to make sure that London is still an attractive and feasible place for people to live and work in the future, which is why I want to increase the supply of affordable housing in London. But also I think that we do have to acknowledge that depending on where you live, you might not have access to that green space. So one of the things that I want to do is rewild London, connecting up more green walking routes. That's something that we've all enjoyed, one of the few things we've been able to in the last year. But not everyone has those routes available. Planting more street trees across our capital. The current mayor has a really poor record on that as well. So I'd work with councils to make sure that they're planting more trees, but also that they're protecting the existing mature tree stock. I'd introduce 10 new parks in our capital as well. And I'd also green our roofs on commercial and residential buildings. So introducing more plants and vegetation and solar panels, and also providing incentives where buildings are commercial for those roofs to be opened up to the public to enjoy urban green spaces. So there's a few of the things that I would do, but you've mentioned the important issue of toxic air pollution in our capital, and what happened to Ella is absolutely disgraceful. It shouldn't be happening to children. So this is an urgent issue that I would also make a top priority to address as mayor. I'm an asthmatic because of the pollution in London myself, and I don't want the next generation consigned to a worse fate. We know that more than 9,000 Londoners are dying prematurely a year because of toxic air pollution. So one of the things I would do is scrap the mayor's £2 billion polluting Silvertown Tunnel project, which would make air quality worse for Black communities in the surrounding boroughs that would be affected by it even worse. And I would invest in clean, green public transport projects instead, and also seek to address issues in our housing stock. I would introduce more electric buses. I want to make sure that the entire fleet is green, so electric or hydrogen by 2028. At the moment, only 4% of them are. And I would prioritise buses on red routes, which again, these are routes that mean that disproportionately the air quality is worse for Black and brown communities along those routes. So that's why I think that needs to be addressed urgently.
Great, thank you. Well, we're out of time for our questions. So thank you so much to Luisa Porritt for joining me and all of you for watching as well. Voting takes place on the 6th of May 2021. Please look at your local please look at your local government website for details of your nearest polling station. You can follow BCA on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at BCA Heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.